Welcome back to our discussion on the autonomic nervous system. So in part two, we're going to be talking about the sympathetic division, which is bigger and more complex, and there's more confusing terminology. So let's begin, shall we? Sympathetic, right, also termed thoracolumbar. So it's going to be found in the thoracic region and the lumbar region of our spinal cord, right? Because preganglionic neuronal cell bodies are found between the first thoracic spinal nerve, T1, and the second lumbar spinal nerve, L2. So the sympathetic division is more complex than the parasympathetic division. The preganglionic cell bodies are housed in the lateral gray horns of the T1 through L2 regions of the spinal cord. Preganglionic axons travel with somatic motor neurons, right, and exit that anterior root, and they're going to form the spinal nerves along with those somatic motor neurons in T1 through L2. So here's our picture. Remember last time in the parasympathetic, up here, we had our parasympathetic in the brainstem and in the sacral portion of the spinal cord. Now, when we're looking for those preganglionic neuronal cell bodies, they're going to be found in the lateral gray horns, in the thoracic and the superior part of the lumbar portion of the spinal cord. Their axons are going to extend out into these structures here called the sympathetic trunk. Right? One of these little balls is a sympathetic trunk ganglion. If you have a synapse in this ganglion, right, then you have your postganglionic axon. Notice postganglionic axons are much longer in the sympathetic division compared to the preganglionic axons. So if this is a little bit confusing, remember, in the autonomic nervous system, the motor efferent system, there's a true neuronal pathway. First neuron is myelinated, second neuron is not myelinated. In the case of the sympathetic division, the preganglionic neuron, the preganglionic axon is very, very short. The ganglionic axon is very, very long. You can see that. Neuron axon number 1, short. Axon number 2, very long. Just to kind of get us back in the picture. So as I mentioned, the sympathetic trunks are these structures here, just lateral to the spinal cord. Right? They're made up of sympathetic trunk ganglion, which are all connected to each other, contain cell bodies of ganglionic neurons. Okay, oh, and I should say that each one of these sympathetic trunk ganglion is associated more or less with one spinal nerve. Right here, we can see the structure of our sympathetic trunk right here. Okay. So postganglionic axons from cell bodies in the superior cervical ganglion distribute to structures of the head and neck. What is he talking about? This picture here. Superior cervical ganglion are going to go to structures in the head and neck. This one right here. Superior cervical ganglion, serve structures in the head and neck. Middle and inferior cervical ganglia house neuronal cell bodies that extend to the postganglionic axons to the thoracic viscera. Let's break this down. Middle and inferior cervical ganglia, so ganglia found in the area of the neck, house neuronal cell bodies that extend postganglionic axons to the thoracic viscera. Go back to this picture. Middle, inferior cervical, extend thoracic region, right? Controlling heart and controlling lungs. Okay, now we need to talk about gray and white ramming. What these are two specific structures, part of a structure that I mentioned before called the rami communicans. So remember last chapter, I showed you this slide and I said we're going to come back to it because there was some stuff going on down here with the autonomic nervous system. Well, we have arrived at that point. So just to give us a little review, we have the central gray matter of the spinal cord. In the anterior gray horns, you're going to find cell bodies of somatic motor neurons. In the lateral gray horns, you find cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons. This whole thing is surrounded by white matter. Efferent information flows out the anterior root. Sensory information flows in from the posterior root. Anterior root, posterior root join together to form a spinal nerve. Spinal nerve branches into the posterior ramus, anterior ramus, and this thing here called the rami communicans. Rami communicans runs to the sympathetic trunk ganglia. So the sympathetic trunks would be coming out of the screen in this direction, just lateral to the spinal cord. So the rami communicans can be broken down. This lateral structure is called the white ramus. White ramus. And the medial structure is called the gray ramus. White and gray. We sort of heard something like that before, right? What was the difference between white matter and gray matter? Presence of myelin. So axons traveling in the white ramus are myelinated. That's why it's called the white ramus. Axons traveling in the gray ramus are not myelinated. Thus they're called gray. This should be ringing a bell, something about the two neuronal pathway. Let me just cut right to it. The first axon, preganglionic axon, is myelinated, so it will run through the white ramus. The postganglionic axon is not myelinated, and it will run through the gray ramus. That's why the white ramus is white and the gray ramus is gray. Gray ramus is gray. So axon number one runs through the white ramus. Axon number 2 is going to run through the gray ramus because it is not myelinated. So I'm doing a little bit of foreshadowing, but let's just pull it back to what we need to understand. The rami communicanus is found just lateral to the spinal nerve. The lateral structure is the white ramus. Medial structure is the gray ramus. Okay, so the gray and white rami connect to the sympathetic trunk associated with each spinal nerve. Preganglionic sympathetic axons of T1 through L2 spinal nerves are carried by the white ramus. Preganglionic sympathetic axons. Preganglionic sympathetic axons, myelinated, carried by the white ramus. Postganglionic sympathetic axons are carried from the sympathetic trunk to the spinal nerve by the gray ramus. Postganglionic sympathetic axons, which are unmyelinated, go through the gray ramus. Gray rami connect to all spinal nerves, including cervical, sacral, and coccygeal spinal nerves. Right? Spinal nerves, these structures here. So again, this is a major case of word soup. If you understand the definitions clearly, you'll know what's going on. If you sort of 70, 80% have the definitions down, total confusion. But once you get the definitions down and clear, clarity. Okay. Preganglionic axons of white rami are myelinated, and posterior ganglion axons of gray rami are unmyelinated. That's why they have that name. Right. This is just the slide I keep coming back to. You can see, because right now we're talking about the sympathetic division. Preganglionic axons are myelinated, pass through the white ramus. Postganglionic axons are unmyelinated, they pass through the gray ramus. Hopefully that is now clear. We've looked at it about 3 different ways. Okay, so let's talk about the sympathetic splenic nerves. What exactly is that? So these are composed of preganglionic sympathetic axons, preganglionic, the unmyelinated ones, that did not synapse in the sympathetic trunk. So they exit the spinal nerve, or they pass through the spinal nerve. They come in through the white ramus, but they don't have a synapse in the sympathetic trunk ganglion. Right? They're going to run anterior from the sympathetic trunk to most of the viscera. So these are the major sympathetic splenic nerves: greater thoracic, lesser thoracic, least thoracic, lumbar splenic, sacral splenic. What the hell is he talking about? Come back to this here: greater thoracic, lesser thoracic, lumbar splenic, right? Notice in this picture, what's the brown is the preganglionic axon. Notice that it just passes right through the sympathetic trunk ganglion. It does not have a synapse. It passes all the way through and has its synapse somewhere out in the body, and a ganglia out in the body. Whereas the ones we just talked about, they will enter the sympathetic trunk and they will have a synapse in the sympathetic trunk. The definition of a splenic pathway is it passes through the sympathetic trunk ganglion and does not have a synapse. It passes through the sympathetic trunk ganglion and does not have a synapse. It will have a synapse in a ganglia somewhere away from the sympathetic trunk. Okay. These were the 5 we needed to know about. So, splenic nerves typically terminate in prevertebral ganglia, so ganglia in front of, right, the vertebra. Ganglia immediately anterior to the vertebral column and to the anterior lateral surface of the aorta, so around the aorta. We'll take a look at that in a second. Tend to cluster around arteries and are named after these arteries. So these splenic nerves are going to follow the arteries. Sympathetic postganglionic axons extend away from the ganglia and innervate many of the abdominal organs. Prevertebral ganglia include celiac ganglion, superior mesenteric ganglion, inferior mesenteric ganglion. When we get into blood vessels, some major ones in our abdominal area are called the celiac trunk, celiac artery, superior mesenteric artery, inferior mesenteric artery. These arteries service your mesenteries, meaning your intestines. So what this is simply saying is these splenic nerves are going to follow major arteries. That's the major takeaway. Types of prevertebral ganglion. So first we have the celiac ganglion, right? Next to the celiac artery, like I just mentioned, really the celiac trunk. Preganglionic axons comprise the greater. This bit of detail is not particularly important. Postganglionic axons innervate stomach, spleen, liver, gallbladder, part of the duodenum, that's part of your small intestine, and the pancreas. So simply what that means is this splenic nerve, part of your sympathetic nervous system, is going to innervate these organs. Superior mesenteric ganglion, right, following the superior mesenteric artery, made up of these segments, T10 through T12. I'm not going to ask you that. Postganglionic axons innervate distal part, the far end of the duodenum, small intestine, pancreas, remainder of the small intestine, large intestines, right, other organs in your abdominal cavity. Am I going to ask you to distinguish which organs are innervated by the superior mesenteric versus the celiac ganglion versus the inferior mesenteric? No. Right. Big picture, I want you to understand. I can't just completely leave out these structures because it doesn't make any sense. So big picture, don't get lost in the details right in here. Inferior mesenteric ganglion, splenic nerve pathway following inferior mesenteric artery, right? Made up of this particular area. I'm not going to ask you about that. Postganglionic axons innervate distal colon, rectum, parts of the urinary bladder, right? And reproductive organs, right? We're just getting more and more inferior. Whew. All right. Complicated. Not really. If you're getting lost as you go through this material, keep coming back to this picture. This is the key to unlocking what's going on and knowing what these structures are. Okay, sympathetic pathways. So here, all preganglionic neurons are going to originate in the lateral gray horns, right, T1 through L1, L2 I should say, of the spinal cord. Preganglionic axons are going to travel with the spinal nerves in this area, T1 through L2. Preganglionic axons immediately leave the spinal nerves and travel through the white ramus to enter the sympathetic trunk. So they're going to enter the sympathetic trunk. Once inside the sympathetic trunk, right, lots of different things can happen, right? They may remain at the level of entry, or they may travel superiorly, or they may travel inferiorly inside the sympathetic trunk. Axons exiting the sympathetic trunk ganglia by multiple pathways. We're going to go through these. So these I do want you to know. The spinal nerve pathway. So in the spinal nerve pathway, postganglionic axons are going to leave via the spinal nerve. Postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway. Let's just go through them one by one. So, spinal nerve pathway. Here we have our preganglionic neuron. Its preganglionic axon, right, is leaving the anterior root. Notice, this is the first neuron. This is the neuron that's myelinated. It's leaving by the anterior root to the spinal nerve to the white ramus. There it enters the sympathetic trunk. Now, in this first example, you have your preganglionic axon is going to have its synapse with a ganglionic axon at the same level of the spinal nerve. This sympathetic trunk ganglion is at the same level as this spinal nerve. You have a synapse at this level, and then the postganglionic axon leaves by the spinal nerve at the same level. So, axon 1 goes to the sympathetic trunk, axon 2 leaves at the same level. Now, our next example, still following a spinal nerve pathway. Our preganglionic axon leaves by the anterior root at a particular level of the spinal nerve. That axon enters through the white ramus and then travels superiorly. It travels one step up to the sympathetic trunk ganglion above, superior to this spinal nerve. There it will have its synapse, and the postganglionic axon is going to leave via that same area, that same spinal nerve. Whereas here we have another example where we have our preganglionic axon leaving by the anterior root to the spinal nerve of one particular area, and then it's going to enter through the white ramus, and then it travels inferiorly through the sympathetic trunk, has its synapse at one level down. Now the ganglionic, or I should say the postganglionic axon, will leave via the spinal nerve at one level down. Notice, in all of these cases, you're having synapses in the sympathetic trunk ganglia. It might be at the sympathetic trunk ganglia of the same level as the spinal nerve. It might be above, it might be below, and the postganglionic axon is leaving by a spinal nerve at the same level, above or below. Okay, postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway. This is a different pathway. Notice that the postganglionic axon is not leaving by the spinal nerve. It is not leaving by the spinal nerve. Here, leaving by the spinal nerve, spinal nerve, spinal nerve. Here it is not leaving by the spinal nerve. So in this example, we have our preganglionic axon entering, leaving the anterior root, passing through the white ramus. It may synapse in the sympathetic trunk ganglion, but notice that the postsynaptic axon does not exit the spinal nerve. It leaves by a different pathway. It's not going through the spinal nerve. It's just straight out leaving the sympathetic trunk ganglion. It is not passing through the gray ramus. Here, passing through the gray ramus, passing through the gray ramus. This one, the second axon is not passing through the gray ramus. It's not leaving via the spinal nerve. It's leaving by this alternate exit point. So postganglionic synaptic nerve pathway. You have your preganglionic axons passing through the white ramus, having a synapse in the sympathetic trunk ganglion, and then they're leaving by an alternate pathway. They're not going through the gray ramus. Now, the next one, splenic nerve pathway. In the splenic nerve pathway, you do not have a synapse in the sympathetic trunk ganglion. Notice that you're having a very long presynaptic axon that passes right through the sympathetic trunk and then finds its ganglia way out close to the target organ. This is weird, right? This is strange because long presynaptic axon, short postganglionic axon is what? That is a characteristic structure of the parasympathetic nervous system. But this is not the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the sympathetic nervous system. So the splenic nerve pathway of the sympathetic pathway looks like the overall structure of the parasympathetic pathway structure. Number one is long, number two is short, right? This confuses a lot of people. So let me try and clear this up. The splenic nerve pathway of the sympathetic autonomic nervous system looks like the parasympathetic situation where you have a long preganglionic axon and a short postganglionic axon. This is an unusual exception. In most cases, right, looking back at this overall structure here, where do we leave off? In most cases, neuron number one is short, neuron number two is long. The exception is our splenic pathways. Number one is long and number two gets short. That's a little bit unusual for the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, last one is the adrenal medullary pathway. This is unusual. Notice we have not a two neuronal pathway like we've seen everywhere else. Now we have a one neuronal pathway. We're going to go right from the lateral gray horns right to the adrenal medulla. Right? One neuronal pathway means it's faster, and it makes sense because when you zap your adrenal gland, what you're going to do, when your sympathetic nervous system zaps your adrenal gland, what's it going to do? It's going to release epinephrine, norepinephrine, right? Part of your fight or flight response. So this one's also unusual because now we have a one neuronal pathway, whereas everywhere else in the ANS we had a two, but this one's special. We have one, we have a hard wire between our central nervous system and our adrenal gland, which makes sense. Fewer synapses, faster response. You want to have an acute stress response happen as quickly as possible. Okay. So, just saying in words, the adrenal medulla pathway involves a connection to the adrenal medulla, right? This is very important for releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. Whew, lots going on there, right? Check out this table, which helps make it clear, right? The origin segment, don't worry too much about that. Okay, now let's talk about autonomic plexuses. Previously, in our chapter on the spinal cord, we had anterior rami branch, interweave, and we got plexuses. We will also have big, complicated, a mess of autonomic nerves all piled together called autonomic plexuses. Right. Just like with the plexuses associated with the anterior ramiospinal nerves, we're not going to get into excessive detail in this section. So, collections of sympathetic postganglionic axons, parasympathetic preganglionic axons, right, because the difference in length, and visceral and sensory axons. We got a lot of stuff all coming together. Sympathetic and parasympathetic axons tend to run very close to each other. What I want you to know is just realize what organ you're around. Cardiac plexus, a big complicated mess of visceral sensory neurons and autonomic neurons all around your heart. Pulmonary plexus, same deal, but around your lungs. Esophageal, around your esophagus. Abdominal aortic plexus, right, around the aorta as it runs through your abdomen. Hypogastric, or more inferior. So just know the general regions of where these things are and know what a plexus is. It's just a big, complicated mess of interwoven nerves. These happen to be associated with the autonomic nervous system. Now, here's the information I do want you to clearly understand, right? Cardiac plexus, obviously it's around the heart. It's going to be the mediastinum. So increased sympathetic activity to your cardiac plexus leads to an increase in heart rate, an increase in cardiac output, and an increase in blood pressure. Increased parasympathetic, because remember, in the cardiac plexus, you have both sympathetic and parasympathetic. Increased parasympathetic activity decreases the heart rate. So a positive signal from your sympathetic nervous system speeds the heart up, greater cardiac output, increased pressure. Positive signal coming in from the parasympathetic has the opposite effect, decreasing heart rate. Right. Pulmonary plexus. Right. Postganglionic sympathetic axons from the thoracic sympathetic trunk ganglion, preganglionic axons from the vagus nerve. Don't worry too much about that part. Big, complicated mess of autonomic nerves, visceral sensory nerves in the area around the lungs. Here's the important part. Parasympathetic stimulation reduces the diameter of your airways, bronchoconstriction, activates mucosal glands, right? So you're going to start producing mucus inside your lungs, right? This is the way, this is important for protecting you. Sympathetic innervation causes bronchodilation, opens up the airways in your lungs. So explain what's going on here. Again, that tiger jumps out of the jungle at you. You need to run. You need to run faster than you've ever run before. Your muscles need to work harder than they ever worked before, right? Those muscles in your lower extremities, they're aerobic muscles. They're going to need a lot of oxygen, which means your respiratory system better deliver it. Otherwise, you are tiger chow. Now, the reverse of that is if you're not running away from a tiger, right? You don't need to bring in lots of extra air. In fact, that could actually be a bad thing, because bringing in more air than you actually need can bring in more dirt to your respiratory system, can bring in more viruses, can bring in more bacteria. If you don't need it, don't bring it in, because it can make you sick. However, if a tiger jumps out at you, are you concerned about viruses or dust in the air? No, because you've got 10 seconds to live or die, so who cares about viruses? So that's why we have the different responses. Parasympathetic, hey, everything's cool. Let's keep it clean, nice, narrow passageways, lots of mucus to trap all that dirt. Oh my God, it's a tiger, right? Don't worry about the dust. Don't worry about the dirt. Get as much air into the system as possible in order to expedite getting away. Esophageal plexus, parasympathetic activity coordinates smooth muscle, swallowing, peristalsis. Abdominal aortic plexus is made up of the celiac plexus, superior mesenteric, inferior mesenteric plexus, composed of postganglionic axons projecting to the prevertebral ganglion and preganglionic axons of the vagus nerve. Don't worry about it. Hypogastric plexus is a meshwork of postganglionic sympathetic axons and preganglionic parasympathetic axons. Not important. Axons innervate the viscera within the pelvic region. That's what I want you to know. Hypogastric plexus, innervation of organs in the pelvic cavity. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about neurotransmitters and the ANS, because it's a little bit more complicated than what we've seen before. All preganglionic axons release acetylcholine, which has an excitatory effect on the ganglion cell. So we have our preganglionic axon, it's going to be releasing acetylcholine. That acetylcholine will excite the ganglionic cell. All postganglionic parasympathetic axons release acetylcholine on their effector. So this is the second neuron. So if you're the second neuron in the parasympathetic division, you're going to be releasing acetylcholine, and it will usually excite that effector, smooth muscle, gland, whatever. Now, depending on the receptor, acetylcholine from parasympathetic axons may either have an excitatory or an inhibitory effect. So let's take a look. All postganglionic parasympathetic axons release acetylcholine from their effector. So the neuron number 2 in the parasympathetic system is releasing acetylcholine. It may excite or it may inhibit. So I think I didn't say that quite right, or didn't say that clearly enough. So all preganglionic axons, sympathetic and parasympathetic, they all release acetylcholine. Neuron number 1 always releases acetylcholine, which always stimulates neuron number 2. For neuron number 2, postganglionic, in the case of parasympathetic axons, they will all release acetylcholine on their effector. And that acetylcholine may excite or it may actually inhibit. Don't worry, I'll have a table that summarizes all of this in a second. Acetylcholine released from sympathetic axons is excitatory only. So if you have acetylcholine being released by your postganglionic axon, if it's releasing acetylcholine, that only excites the effector. Most preganglionic sympathetic axons actually release norepinephrine and not acetylcholine. Now, if they release norepinephrine, that might excite or inhibit the effector. So let's cut to this picture, which has everything, I think, nicely summarized. What I just said in words is confusing because your brain is tired. Check this out. So these two together are our autonomic nervous system. Notice we're having two neuronal pathways. So we have our preganglionic neuron, our our ganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic, or I should say, first of all, the preganglionic axons, all preganglionic axons, all release acetylcholine. That acetylcholine will always stimulate our postganglionic neuron. So this is the same through both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Now, in the case of the parasympathetic pathway, our postganglionic axons will only ever release acetylcholine. They do not release norepinephrine. So parasympathetic, postganglionic axons always release acetylcholine. When that acetylcholine passes a synapse and gets to its effector, it might excite or it might inhibit that effector. Could go both ways. Now, in the case of the sympathetic division, our postganglionic axon can release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. If it releases acetylcholine, it can only excite the effector. No inhibition, only excite. If, however, the postganglionic axon releases norepinephrine, it may either excite or inhibit the effector. So now we see the use of a different neurotransmitter, and we can see that the release of that neurotransmitter may turn something on or it may turn it off. So it's not just as simple that sympathetic always turns something on and parasympathetic always turns something off. No. Right. So it's a mix and it's dependent on particular structures and what particular system you're looking at. Okay, so these two systems, parasympathetic, sympathetic, are going to work together, and most of the target organs are going to have dual innervation, which means both of these systems are going to connect to most organs as a way of controlling these structures. Many visceral effectors, glands, organs, whatever, have innervation by both these systems, right? Meaning innervation by postganglionic axons, neuron number 2, from both divisions of the ANS. Okay, these actions caused by both divisions can be antagonistic or cooperative, meaning that these two systems may work together to do the same thing, or these two systems may work together to do opposite things. Like an example of an antagonistic relationship would be control of the heart. Right? One slows it down, one speeds it up. Okay, almost done. We need to talk about or give an example of an autonomic reflex. So involuntary autonomic reflexes help you maintain homeostasis. The one we're going to take a look at is control of the bladder. Right, consists of smooth muscle contractions, cardiac muscle contractions, gland secretion, blah, blah, blah. But let's talk about the bladder. So here is the bladder. It has a muscular wall called the detrusor muscle. This is smooth muscle. So the muscle of the bladder wall, you do not have conscious control over. It is smooth muscle. When the bladder fills with urine, it blows up and expands like a balloon. This activates stretch receptors in the wall of the bladder. These stretch receptors are going to cause action potentials on the dendrites of visceral sensory neurons. That information is going to travel to the nerves of the body, to the posterior root. Here we have our cell body of our visceral sensory neuron. Its axon projects into the posterior gray horn, where we will find cell bodies of interneurons associated with the visceral sensory nervous system. This is just a little review of the last chapter. Now, our interneuron will then synapse with the cell body of a preganglionic neuron housed in the lateral gray horn. Its axon projects out the anterior root. In this particular example goes through the splenic nerve pathway. Right? That myelinated preganglionic axon is going to travel all the way to its target organ, because this is a splenic pathway. Its structure is a little bit different. There, it will synapse with the postganglionic axon, which in this case is a little bit unusual because it is a short postganglionic axon. That axon will then innervate the wall of the bladder, stimulating the smooth muscle, causing contraction of the bladder. So this is an autonomic reflex. You do not have conscious control over it. The bladder fills, stretch sensors recognize that, an action potential is sent to your spinal cord. An interneuron is going to relay that information to an autonomic motor neuron. That will then send a signal to the muscle of the smooth muscle of your bladder to contract, and you will urinate. Anyone who has cared for patients who are unconscious and do not have a catheter know this is a thing, right? You give them fluids, their bladder fills up, and they will void their bladder. Now, you may be asking yourself, wait a minute, I can control when I go to the bathroom. We have not talked about that. What would you need to have if you want to have conscious control of when you go over the bathroom? You would need to have innervation from your somatic motor nervous system. Your somatic nervous system has to connect to what? It has to connect to skeletal muscle, something that you do have conscious control over. So what am I getting at here? This whole reflexive arc is an autonomic reflex. You don't have conscious control over it, yet you do decide when you go pee, hopefully, if everything's working well. So this right down here, that's going to be some skeletal muscle, right? So that is going to be innervated by your somatic motor nervous system, controlling skeletal muscle, which you do have conscious control over. So what am I getting at here is you have two separate systems. You have autonomic control, unconscious control of your bladder filling up, and then the need to go to the bathroom. However, we can exercise conscious control over the system to make sure we can just wait until when it's convenient. But if you've ever waited too long, been stuck in a car or an airplane or something, and you have to go to the bathroom really bad, it feels like you're fighting yourself, because you are. Your autonomic reflex, right, once the bladder fills up, it's going to activate. It's going to start causing the bladder to compress, right? That's going to put a lot of pressure on your external sphincter, right, which you then are trying to clamp down because you're trying to make it to the bathroom. So yeah, sooner or later, this is going to win, and that's going to lose when that muscle tires out. So if you wait too long, you know what's going to happen. But anyway, just a little example of how your autonomic nervous system and your somatic nervous system are going to work together to give you function and control over things like your urinary system, but we'll get into the specifics of that later. All right, just a little bit, we're gonna, the last slide, we're gonna take a step back and look at big picture. CNS control of the autonomic nervous system's function. Right? Your autonomic nervous system is influenced by your cerebrum. It's controlled by your hypothalamus, because remember in the brain, we talked about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the control center for your autonomic nervous system, right? Brainstem was highly involved and your spinal cord. So we look at this big picture. Cerebrum is where you're going to have consciousness, conscious thought. Hypothalamus control the autonomic nervous center. Right? The brainstem, you have lots of reflexive centers. Remember when we were going through pontine respiratory, cardiac, nuclei, right? Here's where you're going to have the wiring for a lot of complex autonomic reflexes. So let's go through and talk about an example of each. In your cerebrum, conscious activities in the cerebrum will affect the hypothalamus and control the ANS. You're probably listening to this lecture, thinking about this material, and it's stressing you out, right? The thought of this material is going to be activating your autonomic nervous system and your cortisol levels and your stress levels and your blood pressure and all that kind of stuff. Maybe you're having a panic attack. That's a perfect example of a conscious thought triggering a response of your autonomic nervous system. So hypothalamus integration and control center for autonomic functions, including emotions, right? You think a thought, that generates an emotion is going to generate a response in your hypothalamus. Brainstem, right? That's where the reflexes are found. Spinal cord, you have really, really basic reflexes like urination and going to the bathroom, right? Really basic stuff on the spinal cord. But what I'm just trying to show is you can have indirect influence on your autonomic nervous system. Things like biofeedback I mentioned before, right? You slow breathing, you know, think relaxing thoughts that will deactivate sympathetic, start activating the parasympathetic. Your heart rate slows down, right? Deep breathing, right? Relaxation exercise. It's a really good thing. One thing that I do want to point out, sort of big picture here, is stress, right? Is stress good or bad? And the answer is yes, stress is good. Stress is also bad, right? The difference is how long you're exposed to it. The stress response is a fantastic and wonderful thing because it keeps you alive when that tiger jumps out of the jungle, right? You've got 15 seconds to take some sort of action that's going to prevent you from dying. In that case, stress is a very good thing and it's going to preserve your life. However, in modern living, modern day, you know, we have exams and we have bills and we sit on the freeway and we're using this system that was used to protect us from an instantaneous danger and then be turned off, but we're actually activating the system every moment of every day and generating that sympathetic response, and that's bad, right? Because too much stress activates systems that should not be activated all the time. So it's true, stress really kills if you have chronic stress. So it's really important to find times and opportunities to try and decompress, shut the system off once in a while, because it really should only be activated a few times if you lead a long and happy life. But that's not the world we live in. So if you want to know more about that, how stress, chronic stress relates to health, I think there's a really fantastic book. Here it is. It's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. So if you want to learn more about chronic stress, how to avoid it, author's name is Sapolsky. I'll post a picture or a link. It's Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Check it out if you have a little bit of time. I know this is a rough one. This is a rough one, but this is the end of the nervous system, and we can move on from there. Remember, when going over this material, think kind of big picture. Think pathways, think, you know, structure of neurons and how it relates to other structures that we talked about, gray ramus, white ramus, that kind of stuff. And I will leave it there. I will be quiet now and save your questions for Zoom, and we will see you then. Take care.